It all began on a night, so still it felt as if the world had stopped breathing. The kind of quiet that makes every creak in the walls and whisper of wind sound deafening. I woke up suddenly with no idea why, a sharp chill crawling down my spine. As my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the bedside lamp, I felt an odd heaviness in the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. My first instinct was to check on my little brother, as I always did when I woke up in the middle of the night. His bunk was directly beneath mine, and I leaned over cautiously, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. Relief washed over me when I saw him lying there, peaceful and still. For a moment, I felt comforted, remembering our little pact. Whoever woke up first could claim the coveted spot next to Mom in our parents' bed. And tonight, of all nights, my birthday, that spot felt like the perfect gift. A warmth filled me, momentarily drowning out the eerie silence, as I carefully climbed down the ladder, making sure not to disturb him. My bare feet met the cold floor, sending a shiver up my legs. The glow of the lamp barely illuminated the room, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. I tiptoed to the door, eager to escape the growing sense of unease. The hallway beyond was darker than I remembered, a void swallowing the faint light that spilled from the crack under the door. I hesitated, staring into the pitch-black corridor that stretched ahead, the air feeling heavier the closer I got. With a deep breath, I told myself to stop being ridiculous. It was just the hallway, the same one I'd walked through countless times. Yet, something about it felt wrong tonight, unwelcoming, oppressive, as though it were alive and waiting. As I slowly turned the knob, the sound of the latch echoed unnaturally loud, making me flinch. The door opened with a faint creak, and the cold air outside rushed to greet me. The chill was biting, unnatural for this time of year. My breath escaped my lips in visible puffs of white mist, and I froze, feeling a prickle at the back of my neck. It wasn't just cold, it was the kind of chill that sinks deep into your bones, a silent warning your instincts scream at you to heed. Still, I stepped forward, placing one foot in front of the other, each step more cautious than the last. The hallway was a tunnel of blackness, the faint glow from my room quickly swallowed behind me. My hand brushed the wall, guiding me as I moved closer to my parents' door, my sanctuary for the night. But every step felt heavier, my breathing quicker. The silence was so loud it was suffocating, and the faint creaks of the house seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Then it happened. A faint, barely audible sound. Pushed, my entire body froze as if I'd walked into an invisible wall. My mind raced, telling me it was just my imagination, the echo of a dream not fully shaken off. But deep down I knew better. The sound had been real, soft yet deliberate, like someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. My mouth went dry, and I willed myself to keep moving, brushing off the sound as a trick of the wind. As I reached for the doorknob to my parents' room, the sound came again, louder this time. Pissed, my head snapped toward the direction of the noise, and my blood ran cold. The kitchen. It came from the kitchen, just a few steps down the hallway. My heart pounded against my ribs, and I felt the urge to run, to throw myself into my parents' room and bury myself under the blankets. But my body betrayed me. The sound came again, clearer now. A voice, low, guttural, layered as if several people were speaking in unison. "Paula, I have something for you." My name echoed down the hall, and I felt a pressure build in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hand trembled on the doorknob, but it wouldn't turn, as if the door itself refused to open. Behind me, the hallway seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching, curling toward me like claws. I dared to glance back, my heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I saw it, a figure shifting in the blackness, its silhouette barely visible against the oppressive void. My knees buckled, and I felt a scream clawing at my throat, but no sound came out. The air felt thicker now, suffocating, as if I were drowning in the darkness itself. The voice came again, this time louder, closer. "Don't run, child. I'm here for you." And then I saw them, two glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the abyss. The darkness seemed to ripple around them, alive and predatory, and I knew, in that moment, I was no longer alone. The hallway stretched out before me, an endless void of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Each step I took felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted my movement, thick and oppressive like a suffocating fog. The faint light from my room had long since faded, swallowed by the shadows that clung to the walls like a second skin. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt foreign, as if I had crossed an invisible threshold into a realm where the familiar twisted into something unrecognizable. The cold was unnatural, biting into my skin and sinking into my bones, a chill that carried with it an almost sentient malice. My breath escaped in shallow puffs of white mist, dissipating quickly into the void. The floor beneath my bare feet was icy, each step sending a shiver up my spine. I reached out for the wall, hoping for some sense of grounding, but the texture felt wrong. Smooth where it should have been rough, almost slick, like something alive had coated it in a thin layer of slime. A faint hum seemed to emanate from the darkness, so low it was barely perceptible, yet it vibrated in my chest, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat. It wasn't the comforting creaks of an old house settling. It was something else, something purposeful, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets I couldn't quite hear. The silence was oppressive, not the calm stillness of night, but the kind that presses down on you, amplifying every sound until the faintest creak felt deafening. Ahead, the kitchen loomed like a cavernous maw, its entrance shrouded in a deeper blackness. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but the thought of retreating felt just as terrifying. Something about the darkness called to me, a primal pull that was both hypnotic and horrifying. The faint outline of the kitchen door was barely visible, a ghostly frame against the shadows. Beyond it, I could sense the laundry room, a place I'd walked through 100 times but now seemed like the mouth of a void that had no end. As I edged closer, the air grew colder, the temperature plummeting with each step. My vision began to blur slightly, the shadows seeming to shift and ripple like water disturbed by an unseen current. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks, or if the darkness itself was alive, moving and breathing around me. The faint smell of sulfur reached my nose, sharp and acrid, making my stomach churn. It was subtle at first, but with every breath, it grew stronger, mingling with the metallic tang of something that reminded me of blood. A sudden creak shattered the silence, sharp and jarring, as if a heavy weight had shifted on the floor ahead. My heart leapt into my throat, and I froze, every muscle in my body tensed as I strained to see through the thick veil of shadows. The sound came again, closer this time, a deliberate, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. I glanced toward the door to my parents' room, now just a few feet away. It was so close, yet it felt impossibly distant, like a mirage that would dissolve the moment I tried to reach it. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, my ears straining for any hint of movement. That's when I heard it again, a faint guttural whisper, so low it barely reached my ears. "Come closer." The voice was wrong, layered and distorted, as if a dozen voices spoke in unison, their tones ranging from soft and soothing to sharp and menacing. It echoed down the hallway, reverberating in my skull, and I couldn't tell if it was coming from the kitchen or if it was all around me. My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop moving, compelled by a force I couldn't understand. The closer I got to the kitchen, the more the air seemed to thrum with a low, resonant vibration, like the heartbeat of something massive and unseen. My skin prickled, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The shadows seemed to part slightly as I reached the doorway, revealing the faint outline of the kitchen table and chairs. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The table wasn't empty. A shape sat at the far end, hunched and still, its form obscured by the darkness. It was too large to be human, its shoulders broad and unnatural, its head tilted at an odd angle, as if it were studying me. My breath caught in my throat as its head moved, a slow, deliberate turn toward me, though its features were still hidden in shadow. The voice came again, this time clearer, dripping with malice and a sickening sweetness. "Paula, I've been waiting for you." A wave of cold dread washed over me, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure shifted slightly, and for the first time, I saw them, two glowing yellow eyes piercing through the darkness, locking onto me with an intensity that froze me in place. They weren't human. They weren't anything I could comprehend. The smell of sulfur intensified, filling the room and stinging my eyes. My vision blurred, and I stumbled back, my hand brushing the edge of the wall for support. But the wall wasn't smooth anymore. It was wet and sticky, and when I pulled my hand away, it was coated in something dark and viscous. My stomach churned, and my legs wobbled as the figure began to rise, unfolding itself in jerky, unnatural movements. The hum grew louder, now a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from the figure itself. The air vibrated with its presence, and I knew, without a doubt, that whatever was in that kitchen was not of this world. My parents' door was just a step away, but my legs felt like they were moving through quicksand, every step an agonizing effort. Behind me, the figure's voice rang out once more, louder now, shaking the very air around me. Don't run, Paula. You can't escape. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as I clawed my way toward the door, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out my thoughts. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone in this house anymore. The moment I reached my parents' door, my trembling hand clinging to the cold brass doorknob, I felt the first wave of unease wash over me. The air around me grew thicker, heavier, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. My breath hitched, shallow and quick, as if the very act of inhaling required more effort than it should. A faint creaking sound echoed behind me, soft, deliberate, and wrong. It wasn't the random groan of an old house settling. It was rhythmic, calculated, and it was getting closer. I froze in place, my mind racing with denial. It's nothing, I told myself. Just my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I knew better. The sound wasn't random. It carried intent, each creak deliberate, as though someone or something was stepping lightly, testing the boundaries of my fear. Then came the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the suffocating silence like a blade. Paula. The voice was soft yet guttural, carrying a sickly sweetness that made my stomach churn. It felt close, too close. My name didn't just echo in the hallway. It lingered in the air, as if the shadows themselves were speaking directly into my ear. Every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to flee into my parents' room and bury myself under the covers like a frightened child. But the door wouldn't budge. The knob turned, but the door remained locked, as if the house itself had turned against me. Panic surged through me, and my knuckles whitened as I gripped the handle tighter, desperately twisting and pulling. The whisper came again, louder this time, dripping with malice. Paula, I have a gift for you. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it might burst from my chest. I forced myself to turn, my movements sluggish and reluctant, as if some unseen force was holding me back. The hallway behind me was darker than before, the shadows impossibly thick, writhing like living things. Then I saw it, movement in the corner of my eye. Something shifted in the depths of the hallway, a subtle flicker that sent a chill racing down my spine. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. My pulse quickened, and my skin prickled with an overwhelming sense of being watched. The air grew colder, each breath forming a faint mist that swirled and dissipated in the oppressive darkness. My fingers slipped from the doorknob as I stumbled back, my feet scraping against the icy floor. The sound of my own movements felt deafening in the suffocating silence. Then came the laughter, soft at first, a faint chuckle that sent shivers cascading down my body. It wasn't human. It was layered, distorted, a chorus of voices overlapping and intertwining in a grotesque harmony. The sound crawled under my skin, burrowing into my mind and filling every corner with dread. As I stared into the blackness, the laughter grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the walls in a way that made the hallway feel endless. My eyes strained to make sense of the shifting shadows, and then I saw them, two faint pinpricks of yellow light, glowing like embers in the distance. They blinked once, then twice, and began to move, swaying side to side like a predator stalking its prey. The laughter stopped abruptly, plunging the hallway into an eerie, suffocating silence. Then the voice returned, its tone both mocking and commanding. Don't you want to see your gift? The sound of something dragging across the floor echoed in the darkness, slow and deliberate. My body trembled, and my knees threatened to give out as I backed away, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. My hand shot out toward the wall for support, but the surface was cold and wet, slick with a substance that clung to my skin. When I pulled my hand back, it glistened faintly in the dim light, a dark, viscous liquid that reeked of decay and iron. My stomach churned, while rising in my throat as the stench overwhelmed me. The dragging sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that resonated deep in my chest. The glowing yellow eyes drew closer, their light cutting through the darkness and illuminating faint glimpses of a twisted form, jagged, angular limbs that moved unnaturally, bending and contorting in ways that defied logic. My legs locked in place, rooted to the floor by sheer terror. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as the figure emerged from the shadows, its grotesque shape slowly coming into focus. It was massive, hunched and crawling, its skin slick and glistening like oil. A wide, toothless grin stretched across its face, impossibly large and oozing a dark, tar-like substance. The voice came again, this time right behind me, though the creature was still several feet away. Don't run, Paula. It's already yours. I spun around, expecting to see something standing inches from my face, but there was nothing, just the unyielding door to my parents' room. My hands flew to the knob, twisting and pulling with every ounce of strength I had, but it refused to open. Tears blurred my vision as the growl behind me deepened, reverberating through the floor. Then I felt it, a cold, bony hand brushing against the back of my leg. It was brief, barely a touch, but it sent a jolt of pure terror through my body. My scream finally broke free, echoing down the hallway and swallowed almost immediately by the darkness. I collapsed to the floor, trembling and sobbing, as the creature's laughter rose once more, louder and more menacing than before. The glowing eyes loomed closer, and I knew with chilling certainty that there was no escape. Whatever this was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't going to let me go. The doorknob was unyielding beneath my trembling hand, its cold brass biting into my palm as I twisted and pulled with growing desperation. The hallway seemed to close in around me, the oppressive darkness pressing against my back like a living force. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one clouding the icy air before me. Behind me, the laughter had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that felt far more sinister. The creature was waiting. I dared not turn around, but the weight of its presence was unbearable. I could feel it, its gaze burning into the back of my head, its grotesque form lurking just beyond my sight. My thoughts raced, each one more frantic than the last. Should I try to flee? Run back down the hallway, past whatever horror lay in the kitchen, and hope to find safety somewhere else? Or should I confront the thing behind me, the shadow that had already claimed the air and light as its own? My instincts screamed to run, but the house itself seemed to conspire against me. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, an abyss with no end. Even if I tried to flee, I felt certain the creature would reach me before I took my second step. My hands clutched the doorknob tighter, my knuckles whitening with the effort. A single thought whispered through the chaos in my mind: turn around. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, my body frozen in a cocktail of terror and indecision. And yet, the oppressive silence behind me felt more unbearable than the thought of facing whatever lurked there. Slowly, I began to shift my weight, my body moving almost against my will. My head turned incrementally, each movement a battle against the primal fear that screamed for me to stop. Before I could fully turn, the voice broke the silence. Don't look away, Paula. My heart stopped. The voice wasn't coming from behind me. It was in front of me, as though the very air had spoken. My gaze snapped back to the door, and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me. The doorknob twisted in my hand, but not from my efforts. It moved on its own, slowly turning until it clicked open. The door creaked as it swung inward, revealing the dim glow of my parents' room. Relief washed over me for a fleeting moment, a single heartbeat of hope that maybe, just maybe, I had imagined everything. But as I stepped forward, the warmth I had expected to find was absent. The air inside the room was colder than the hallway, sharp and biting against my skin. Something was wrong. The shadows in the room felt alive, twisting and curling unnaturally, as if they were recoiling from an unseen force. My parents' bed was empty, the blankets neatly tucked as though no one had slept there. My heart sank as I took a tentative step inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. Then I heard it again. Come closer, Paula. The voice was softer this time, coaxing, almost kind. It came from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest, pooling like ink in the faint light. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, something waiting, something watching. My chest tightened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wanted to run, to slam the door shut and never look back. But something about the voice held me in place, its tone pulling at me like a thread unraveling my will. I stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate, as though my body was no longer entirely my own. The air grew colder with each step, the shadows deepening until they seemed to envelop me entirely. My foot brushed against something soft, and I froze. Looking down, I saw it, a single white feather lying on the floor, pristine and out of place. It glowed faintly in the dim light, its edges tinged with a faint golden hue. For a moment, it seemed almost comforting, a small beacon in the darkness. But then I noticed the trail. The feather wasn't alone. A line of them stretched across the floor, leading to the far corner of the room where the shadows writhed. My stomach churned, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The voice came again, firmer now, its sweetness laced with an edge of impatience. Don't be afraid. Come and see your gift. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed to stop, to turn and flee into the hallway. But I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward, step by agonizing step. The closer I got to the corner, the heavier the air became, pressing against my chest until I could barely breathe. As I reached the edge of the shadow, my knees buckled, and I fell to the floor. The cold seeped through my skin, numbing my limbs and making it impossible to move. My eyes strained to see through the darkness, but the shadows were impenetrable, a void that seemed to devour the light. Then it emerged. A hand, skeletal and dripping with a thick, tar-like substance, extended from the shadows. Its fingers were impossibly long, curling and twitching as they reached toward me. My breath hitched, and I tried to scramble backward, but my body refused to obey. The hand stopped inches from my face, and for the first time, I saw what it held. It was a box. Small, wooden, and intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. The edges glowed faintly, the same golden hue as the feathers on the floor. My heart pounded as the hand extended further, pushing the box toward me. The voice came one final time, cold and commanding. "Take it, Paula. It's yours now." My hand moved against my will, trembling as I reached out to grasp the box. The moment my fingers touched it, the shadows erupted, swallowing the room in complete darkness. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of my own name, whispered from a million voices. The box sat heavy in my hands, its wooden surface cold and rough, as though it had been carved from a tree that had never seen sunlight. The intricate symbols etched across its surface seemed to shift under my touch, their shapes writhing like living things. The faint golden glow that had first caught my eye now pulsed faintly, as though the box itself had a heartbeat. The air in the room thickened further, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. I wanted to drop it, to let it shatter on the floor and run as far away as possible, but my hands wouldn't obey. They clutched the box, as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The voice returned, louder now, resonating from every corner of the room. "Open it, Paula. See the gift I've brought for you." The tone was sickly sweet, yet laced with a malice that made my skin crawl. I shook my head, muttering a weak refusal, but the shadows around me seemed to close in, suffocating and relentless. The glow from the box intensified, illuminating the twisted forms of the shadows that surrounded me. They weren't just darkness, they had shape, substance. Faces began to emerge from the blackness, their features grotesque and inhuman. Eyes that burned like dying embers stared at me, unblinking, as mouths twisted into wide, jagged grins. Some whispered in low, guttural tones, their voices incomprehensible but filled with a sinister hunger. Others let out soft, wheezing laughter that sent chills racing down my spine. "Open it," the voice commanded again, more insistent this time. My hands moved involuntarily, my fingers fumbling with the small clasp that sealed the box. My breath quickened, each inhale sharp and shallow, as though the air itself was resisting my lungs. I wanted to scream, to fight the invisible force guiding me, but it was no use. My body was no longer my own. As the clasp clicked open, a wave of icy air burst from the box, extinguishing the faint golden glow and plunging the room into an even deeper darkness. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath fogging the air in short, rapid bursts. The room was silent for a moment, an oppressive, deafening silence that made my ears ring. Then it began. A low, guttural sound emanated from the box, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't a voice, it was a vibration, a deep resonance that seemed to shake the very walls around me. The shadows writhed violently, their forms twisting and contorting in impossible ways. The faces in the darkness drew closer, their features becoming more distinct, more grotesque. From within the box, a light began to grow, not golden this time, but a sickly, pulsating red that cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. The light revealed the source of the sound, a dark, viscous substance bubbling up from the box's depths. It oozed over the edges, thick and tar-like, spreading across my hands and dripping onto the floor. The smell hit me then, a nauseating stench of sulfur and decay that made my stomach churn violently. The substance moved as if alive, slithering up my arms with an unnatural speed. It was cold at first, but as it climbed higher, it burned, searing my skin like acid. I cried out, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the deafening hum that now filled the room. The shadows seemed to feed on my pain, their laughter growing louder, more frenzied. The light from the box flared suddenly, and from within it, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was nothing more than a faint outline, a distorted silhouette that seemed to ripple like water. But as it stepped closer, its form solidified, and my heart stopped. The creature was massive, its hunched frame barely fitting within the confines of the room. Its limbs were impossibly long, ending in gnarled, claw-like hands that scraped against the floor. Its skin was pale and mottled, stretched tightly over bones that jutted out at unnatural angles. But its face was the worst of all. Where its eyes should have been, there were only hollow sockets, black and empty, yet somehow piercing. Its mouth was a jagged slash that stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of sharp, uneven teeth that seemed to glisten with the same tar-like substance crawling up my arms. It smiled at me, a slow, deliberate grin that oozed malice. "Do you like your gift?" it hissed, its voice now emanating directly from the gaping hole where its mouth should have been. The sound was layered, overlapping voices echoing in different tones and pitches. I tried to back away, but the tar had reached my shoulders, anchoring me in place. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to my knees, the box falling from my hands and landing with a hollow thud on the floor. The creature loomed over me, its form blotting out the faint red light. "You're mine now," it whispered, bending down until its hollow sockets were level with my eyes. Its breath was rancid, hot and reeking of rot, and I gagged as it enveloped me. The tar tightened its grip, pulling me closer to the creature's twisted form. With a sudden jerking motion, it reached into its chest and pulled out something that glistened in the faint light. It was another box, smaller than the first, and etched with the same writhing symbols. It held the box out to me, its grin widening as it spoke. "This is just the beginning, Paula. Take it, and you'll see." My hands trembled as they moved on their own, reaching out to accept the second box. The moment my fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through my body, and my vision blurred. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the creature's grin, impossibly wide and filled with triumph. The world dissolved into blackness as the second box pulsed in my hands, its surface searing hot yet impossibly cold at the same time. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still in my parents' room or somewhere far beyond. The air around me vibrated with an unnatural hum, a deep resonance that burrowed into my chest and rattled my ribs. My limbs felt heavy, my body paralyzed by the tar-like substance still clinging to my skin. And then slowly the darkness began to lift, not with light, but with an unsettling clarity. The shadows peeled away like layers of smoke, revealing a distorted version of the room I had known my entire life. The walls were warped, their surfaces pulsing as though they were alive. The once familiar furniture was now twisted and grotesque, the bed frame bending unnaturally, the nightstand covered in writhing, vein-like tendrils. The air reeked of sulfur and rotting flesh, and the floor beneath me was no longer solid. It felt soft, spongy, as though I were kneeling on something organic. The creature stood before me, taller now, its form towering over the warped room. Its hollow sockets stared down at me, yet I felt its gaze pierce through to the very core of my being. The second box in my hands pulsed violently, its carvings glowing a deep crimson that bathed the room in a sinister light. The symbols on its surface writhed and shifted, forming patterns that felt both alien and ancient, as if they held truths that no human was meant to understand. The creature leaned closer, its jagged teeth glistening as it spoke. "Do you see it now, Paula?" The voice wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force that seemed to invade every corner of my mind. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my throat was dry, my voice stolen by the sheer weight of the moment. The box began to vibrate in my hands, the carvings glowing brighter and brighter until they were nearly blinding. Suddenly, the room around me shifted, the walls melting away like wax under an invisible flame. I was no longer in my parents' bedroom. I was somewhere else. The new space was vast and infinite, a landscape of darkness broken only by the faint, eerie glow of floating orbs that pulsed in the distance. The ground beneath me was cold and slick, like polished stone, yet it felt as though it were alive, vibrating faintly beneath my weight. The air was thick and oppressive, carrying a low, rhythmic hum that matched the pulse of the box in my hands. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, humanoid shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Their features were indistinct, their forms cloaked in flowing blackness that merged seamlessly with the surrounding void. They moved without sound, gliding toward me in eerie silence. The creature stepped forward, its massive frame dwarfing the flickering figures. Its grin widened as it gestured toward the box in my hands. "Open it, child. See the truth of what you are." My hands trembled as I tried to resist, but the box had a will of its own, its lid creaking open as though guided by an unseen force. The moment it cracked open, a blinding light burst forth, engulfing me in its searing glow. But it wasn't just light. It was a vision, a flood of images that slammed into my mind with unbearable force. I saw myself as a child, standing in the same hallway, staring at the same door. But this version of me wasn't afraid. My face was cold, emotionless, my eyes glowing with the same sickly yellow hue as the creatures. Behind me, the hallway was alive with shadows, twisting and writhing as they reached for me. The vision shifted, and I was no longer in my house. I stood in a vast, endless void, surrounded by countless other figures, children like me, each clutching a box identical to the one in my hands. Their faces were blank, their eyes glowing as they moved in perfect unison, forming a circle around a massive, pulsing entity that towered above us all. The entity was the source of the hum, its form indescribable, a shifting mass of limbs, eyes, and mouths that seemed to defy logic. Its presence was overwhelming, a weight that pressed down on me with crushing intensity. And then, in a voice that echoed across the void, it spoke. "You are mine, Paula. You have always been mine." The vision shattered, and I was back in the warped room, the box still clutched in my trembling hands. The creature stood over me, its grin impossibly wide, as though it could sense my realization. I tried to speak, to deny what I had seen, but the words caught in my throat. Deep down, I knew the truth. The creature wasn't a visitor. It was part of me, a shadow that had always been there, waiting. The box wasn't a gift. It was a key, unlocking something buried deep within my soul. The creature's voice filled the room once more, its tone dripping with triumph. "Now you understand. Now you are complete." The tar-like substance spread further, consuming my arms, my chest, until it seeped into my skin. A burning pain radiated through my body as the box dissolved in my hands, its glow fading into me. The shadows around me writhed with anticipation, their laughter rising in a deafening crescendo. And then, as the last shred of my humanity slipped away, I smiled. A wide, jagged grin that mirrored the creature's own. The room fell silent, and I stood, no longer afraid, no longer human. The creature stepped back, bowing slightly as it gestured toward the doorway. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone, replaced by a strange, exhilarating clarity. I walked forward, the shadows parting to let me pass. Beyond the door, the hallway stretched endlessly, its darkness welcoming me home. I was no longer Paula. I was something more, something greater, and the world would soon know what I had become. The hallway stretched before me, an endless tunnel of darkness that seemed to breathe and shift as I stepped into it. The house, once familiar and comforting, had transformed into something unrecognizable, a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, its walls pulsing with a life of their own. The tar-like substance that had consumed my body now felt like a second skin, cold yet alive, pulsing in rhythm with a faint, otherworldly heartbeat that reverberated through my chest. Behind me, the creature stood in the doorway of my parents' room, its hollow sockets glowing faintly as it watched me with an expression that was almost pride. Its jagged grin widened as it spoke, its voice echoing through the hallway like a chorus of distorted screams. "Go, child. Your purpose awaits." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The words felt foreign, unnecessary, as though they no longer had a place in whatever I had become. My body moved on its own, each step deliberate, the floor beneath my bare feet cold and damp. The shadows around me writhed and coiled, whispering unintelligible words that sent chills racing down my spine. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, sentient, and they seemed to welcome me as one of their own. As I walked, the walls began to change, their surfaces rippling like liquid. Faces emerged from the dark, grotesque and twisted, their mouths opening in silent screams that seemed to echo within my mind. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the same sickly yellow that now burned within my own. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and block out the horrifying sight, but I couldn't. Something compelled me to keep watching, to bear witness to whatever truths the shadows held. The hallway began to narrow, its walls pressing closer until they brushed against my shoulders. The air grew heavier, suffocating, each breath a struggle against the oppressive weight. I felt the tar on my skin pulse and shift, tightening around my chest as though it were alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they coalesced into a single, unmistakable word. "Home." I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest as the shadows before me parted, revealing a door at the end of the hallway. It was identical to my parents' door, simple, wooden, unassuming, yet it radiated an aura of overwhelming dread. The faint light from the warped hallway cast long, jagged shadows across its surface, and the doorknob gleamed like polished bone. I reached out, my hand trembling as my fingers brushed against the cold, smooth surface of the knob. The whispers fell silent, the air around me stilling as though the entire house was holding its breath. I hesitated, a flicker of fear piercing through the haze that had consumed my mind. "Go on, Paula," the creature's voice called from behind me, softer now, almost mocking. "It's time to embrace what you are." I turned the knob. The door creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down my spine, revealing a room bathed in a dim, pulsating red light. The space was vast, far larger than it should have been, its walls stretching into an infinite void. The floor was a mosaic of black and crimson, slick and glistening, as though it were made of fresh blood. At the center of the room stood a figure. It was small, trembling, and familiar. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized it. It was my brother. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clutching a small, wooden box identical to the one I had opened. The glow from the box cast eerie shadows across his face, illuminating the tears streaming down his cheeks. "Paula," he whimpered, his voice barely audible. "Help me." Something inside me stirred, a faint echo of the person I used to be. My legs trembled as I stepped closer, the tar-like substance on my skin writhing in protest. My brother's eyes locked onto mine, filled with a desperate hope that pierced through the overwhelming darkness. But then the whispers returned. Louder this time, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice. The shadows in the room shifted and twisted, forming a circle around my brother as though to protect him, or trap him. The creature appeared behind me, its towering form casting a long, jagged shadow across the room. "He is your first offering," it hissed, its voice dripping with triumph. "Take him, and your transformation will be complete." I froze, my hands trembling as I looked between my brother and the creature. The tar on my skin tightened, its cold grip pulling me toward him, urging me to obey. My brother's cries grew louder, his small hands clutching the box tighter, as though it could shield him from what was coming. The room began to pulse, the crimson light growing brighter and more erratic. The shadows danced wildly, their whispers turning into guttural screams that reverberated through my skull. My vision blurred, and my legs moved forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached him, my brother fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The box slipped from his hands, landing on the floor with a hollow thud. I reached down, my fingers brushing against its surface, and for a moment, the glow from the box illuminated my face. My brother's eyes widened, his lips trembling as he whispered, "Paula, your eyes." I didn't need to see my reflection to know what he meant. The sickly yellow glow that had consumed me was now fully realized, burning brightly in my gaze. The tar-like substance surged forward, spreading from my hands to the box, engulfing it in seconds. The creature's laughter filled the room, a deafening roar that drowned out my brother's cries. My hands moved on their own, reaching for him as the shadows closed in around us. He screamed, a sound that would haunt me, if I were still capable of feeling haunted. The last thing I saw was his terrified face before the shadows consumed him, his voice silenced as the room fell into darkness. And then there was silence. The tar receded, leaving my skin smooth and cold. The shadows around me bowed, their forms flickering as though in reverence. The creature stepped forward, its jagged grin widening as it placed a hand on my shoulder. "Welcome home, Paula," it said, its voice filled with pride. "You are one of us now." I turned toward the hallway, my steps steady and deliberate. The house was silent once more, the whispers gone. But deep within me, I could still hear the faint echo of my brother's voice, a distant memory drowned by the chorus of shadows that now called me their own. I walked into the darkness, the house embracing me as its new master. And in the silence, I smiled. The silence in the house was absolute, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed against the walls and floors like a living thing. The once familiar creaks and groans of the old wood were gone, replaced by an oppressive void that swallowed even the faintest sound. I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands resting on my knees, staring into the darkness that now felt like an extension of myself. The tar-like substance was gone, absorbed into my skin, but its presence lingered, a cold, pulsing rhythm that matched the beat of my heart. I wasn't the same. I couldn't be. The shadows that writhed in the corners of the room whispered to me constantly now, their voices a low, incomprehensible hum that filled every quiet moment. I didn't understand their words, but I felt their meaning, approval, anticipation, hunger. They were waiting, always waiting. My brother's room was silent. The bunk bed, once a place of sibling arguments and whispered late-night stories, was untouched. His side of the room was unnervingly tidy, as if he had simply disappeared, leaving no trace behind. I knew better. I could still feel the faint echo of his presence, a tiny spark buried deep within the void that now consumed this house. The hallway outside my room stretched endlessly into darkness, its walls pulsing faintly, alive with the same energy that coursed through me. The memories of what had happened there were sharp, vivid, etched into my mind with a clarity that refused to fade. The glowing eyes, the whispers, the creature that had shaped me into this new, hollow form. They haunted me, not as nightmares but as constant companions, shadows that would never leave. As I sat in the dim light of my room, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, sadness, and something darker, something that churned deep within me. The part of me that was still human, that still remembered what it was like to laugh and cry and feel safe, fought against the encroaching darkness. But it was losing. With every passing moment, the tar spread further, seeping into the corners of my mind, extinguishing what little light remained. The house, too, had changed. It was no longer just a building. It was alive, a twisted entity that thrived on fear and despair. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint, rhythmic vibration, and the floors felt soft and damp underfoot, as if the very structure had merged with the shadows that consumed it. Doors that once opened to familiar rooms now led to endless voids, places that defied logic and reason. I had stopped trying to explore them. I thought of my parents. Their faces flashed in my mind, their eyes wide with that sickly yellow glow, their smiles stretched unnaturally as they laughed and welcomed me into their madness. Were they still here, somewhere in the depths of this shadowy labyrinth? Or had they become something else entirely, something unrecognizable? The thought sent a chill through me, a rare flicker of fear that reminded me of what I had lost. The whispers grew louder, pulling me from my thoughts. They were calling me again, urging me to rise, to step into the darkness and embrace what I had become. I hesitated, my hands clutching the edges of the bed as I fought against the pull. But it was no use. The shadows were patient, and they always won. As I stood, the room seemed to shift around me, the walls bending and twisting like living things. The shadows parted, creating a path that led back into the hallway. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the darkness, toward whatever awaited me beyond the confines of this broken house. At the end of the hallway, a mirror stood where there had been none before. Its surface was cracked, the fractures forming jagged patterns that seemed to pulse with the same crimson light that had consumed the box. I approached slowly, my reflection coming into focus with each step. What I saw wasn't me, not the me I remembered anyway. My eyes glowed faintly, a sickly yellow that burned with an unnatural intensity. My face was pale, my features sharper, hollowed out by the darkness that now consumed me. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the glass rippled under my fingers like water. The whispers surged, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of malice and triumph. The shadows behind me writhed and twisted, their forms coalescing into shapes that were almost human, but not quite. They gathered around the mirror, their faces blank, their movements unervingly fluid. I stared into the glass, my hands still pressed against its surface. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something behind me, my brother's face, his eyes wide with fear, his mouth open in a silent scream. But the vision was gone as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the writhing shadows that encased us both. The house was no longer just a home. It was a prison, a realm of shadows and despair that I could never escape. And yet, as I stood before the mirror, the whispers filling my ears, I felt something I hadn't expected: acceptance. The last shred of humanity within me flickered and faded, snuffed out by the darkness that now ruled my mind. I smiled, my reflection mirroring the jagged, unnatural grin that had once belonged only to the creature. The shadows around me bowed, their whispers rising in a crescendo of adoration. I turned away from the mirror, stepping into the darkness with purpose. The house welcomed me, its walls pulsing with approval as the whispers grew louder, filling every corner with their haunting song. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer human. And as the darkness closed in, I realized the truth: I was home. Forever.